Okay, guys, it's 11:59, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have a tendency to be verbose, and I want to really keep this under 30 minutes, so I'm going to jump right in. This is Thinking Beyond Story, and in this talk, I want to start by clarifying what I mean by the terms story and narrative, because these are overlapping, but I think pretty distinct terms. I want to offer some examples of effective narrative interactions from recent games and VR experiences. And I want to end on some takeaways to consider, especially in the XR space, because I'm aware that we are in the reality stream. A note about the framing of this talk, though. I come from games, and this is obviously being filtered through my experience, so a lot of the examples that I'm going to show are from games. I also have an annoying tendency to use the word games as sort of a catch-all for interactive media. I apologize for that. But the underlying principles and the takeaways are just as important and relevant to the XR space as they are in games. And in fact, I think in some ways they're more relevant because in the XR space, work is not beholden to the same pressures of game mechanics, and I think there's a lot more conceptually open atmosphere to the kinds of experiences that can be crafted in that space. A bit about myself. So my background is in animation, but I have been involved in indie game development for a few years now. In the past year, I've transitioned into full-time work in games. I'm currently the art and animation director at Servo Studios, which is a small studio behind a rather successful little narrative mobile game called Guildlings, which you may have heard of. We're now working on its follow-up. You'll notice the black bars here because last night at 11 p.m., my producer/husband, who's sitting right here, informed me that I was not allowed to share the name of it with you because it hasn't been announced yet. So sorry about that. But it's a narrative game that's set in a fantasy small town, and you're playing as a teenager who's been chosen to live stream your last week of high school on this social media reality show. And at its core, it's really about how the persona that you're being pressured to perform is at odds with your personal relationships in your small town. And this is a place that has some significant collective trauma in its past. In addition to my professional work at Servo, I'm always tinkering on my own weird little projects, and they've been supported by the Sundance Institute, Stugan Indie Game Accelerator, and most recently, Wellington City of Film. So as I said, I come to games from a background in linear animated filmmaking, and on the one hand, this made me, I feel like, entirely unprepared for jumping into any kind of interactive form, especially trying to tackle narrative in games versus films. It also means, though, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff because I've had to. So many of the processes and the tools that work in linear storytelling and also in linear production just break down completely when you're designing for interactive content. So I come from a world where you can perfectly plan out your work from storyboarding to look development, and then you just make the thing. You just jump into production, and that's it. Obviously, this is not how games work. This is not how interactive media work. I don't need to tell anybody in this room that. And so I feel like perhaps my most relevant credential for this talk is just the fact that I've been hardcore wrestling with this stuff for a few years, and my thinking around it has evolved pretty considerably since I started. First things first, I want to clarify these terms, story versus narrative. They're often used interchangeably, but while they're related, I really strongly believe these are not the same. Story is concrete. It tells your audience what is happening. Narrative is expressive. It crafts an experience for your audience of what is happening. A shorter version is to say that the story is the what you're telling, and narrative is the how you're telling it. And all storytelling and narrative work is an interplay between these two things. The balance can differ pretty significantly across different forms. So if you're thinking of it as kind of a spectrum with story weighted on one end and narrative on the other, you can think of, way over on the story end, something like Associated Press journalism, which is trying to give you story with as minimal narrative as possible. And on the other end, we've got something like lyric poetry, which is largely unconcerned with story. It's just trying to create an emotional experience. Another way of putting this is to say that the aim of story is to tell you, and the aim of narrative is to involve you. And because they have different aims, they also have different tools. So the tools of story are things like character, settings, actions, events. They tell you the who, the where, the what, and the how. The tools of narrative are emotive, and they're often abstract. So they imply connections and concepts the audience must ultimately filter for themselves and process for themselves. And I think the big takeaway here is that in narrative, there's room for the audience to bring in fragments of themselves into that process. So if story is a statement, narrative is much more an invitation. The main reason I'm harping on this distinction is because as a storytelling medium, interactive work, and especially games, gets a lot of flack and skepticism from media and games critics. You can just look at the byline of this 2017 piece by Ian Bogost, where he says, film, television, and literature all tell them better, so why are games still obsessed with narrative? He's essentially asserting a classic ludologist perspective. This is a person who believes that games should be understood as a separate medium from traditional narrative forms like film and television or literature, and that the essential elements of gameplay have nothing to do with storytelling. I'm personally not a ludologist, but I do have skepticism around story-based games, and I think that skepticism is fair. Games are not good for telling stories because, not least of all, because they require active player input and interaction. And that creates this kind of, it's almost like a co-authorship of the moment-to-moment experience of games that kind of flies in the face of traditional tools of linear storytelling. By the way, if you guys want a deep dive into the ludologist perspective, I can highly recommend this recent game by C.T. Wynn called Games Agency as Art. It's an incredibly thorough study of how agency operates in games of all kinds, not just video games. So chess, football, tabletop games, any kind of game. And ultimately, Wynn argues that agency is at the heart of aesthetic experience of games, not things like visual design or narrative craft, or these things that we associate more strongly with other forms of medium. And to be fair, game developers know that player agency gets in the way of storytelling. Gameplay is not the most elegant, efficient, or effective way of telling stories. And we know that they know this because they've developed all kinds of workarounds for how to insert story into games. Things like cutscenes and environmental storytelling that involve written materials and objects, rather than directly through gameplay mechanics. And so in story-intensive games like these, you'll find that the experience often becomes bifurcated between these periods of storytelling, like where you're watching a cutscene or you're going through long periods of dialogue, and periods of gameplay where you're actually doing something. And even as you play, these can feel like two different modes. It doesn't always feel like a unified experience. So I will say that I generally agree that games are not the most efficient, elegant, or effective medium for telling stories. But where I disagree, or at least depart from ludologists, is that it really comes down to this distinction between stories and narrative. Because I also believe that games, and really all forms of interactive media, can be a uniquely powerful medium for crafting narrative. For me, these are not interchangeable terms. If story tells, narrative involves. If story is a statement, narrative is an invitation. One of these implies much more room for player agency than the other. Player input adds this whole new set of tools for generating sensations and feelings that can create or enhance narrative content. And it can embody themes and metaphors or inhabit POV in ways that would be impossible in linear media. I want to get into some specific examples from games and VR where I think player input itself creates, supports, or enhances narrative, the narrative content. When I'm talking about player input, I mean simply both the way you control and the what you control. And I'm going to talk about 5 examples that I think are quite effective narrative interactions from 5 different works. Each of the works has uses a different mode of player input. I've pulled each of these examples from a larger piece, and I do want to caveat, I'm not necessarily advocating for the overall quality of the narrative in these full experiences. I'm just pulling out specific moments of player input that I think are quite effective and where that narrative effect really clicks. I also need to just give you guys a blanket spoiler alert for these, sorry. Hopefully I'm not going to be ruining anybody's experience. I don't think anything is too terrible, but FYI. Okay, so the first example is a game called Kids by, it's the second collaboration between Michael Frey and Mario von Rickenbach after their also really wonderful Plug and Play. And it kind of exists somewhere between a game and an interactive film. It actually was also released in film format. The game is played with touch controls on a mobile device, and it takes you through a series of vignettes that speak to the experience of being part of or being excluded from a crowd. Being called kids, it also speaks to the universal themes of childhood, things like finding oneself, fitting in, and the social anxieties around acceptance and rejection. There's a moment in the game where you see this group of kids, and as you click on them, you'll notice that each character around you starts pointing at that person until you yourself finally choose one of these characters to single out. And if you keep tapping on them, all of the children start pointing at that person. The thing that works so well about this is that both the way and the what of the player input are in such harmony here. You're using your finger to tap, and that tapping mirrors the pointing action. And that gesture is quite loaded. It feels accusatory or even like a little bit dangerous. And it's so much more effective than if you were playing this with, for example, a game controller or keyboard. I really think that this moment captures the anxiety of being like a participant in a system where you don't really understand what the motivation for, you don't know why you're doing this, and you also don't know what's going to happen to this poor kid that you're singling out. It's kind of childhood in a nutshell. You're just kind of acting out these systems that you don't understand. There's another great example from a game called How Do You Do It by Nina Freeman. This is actually a 1-minute game. You're going to see the full game, essentially, on the next slide. And here's the setup. You play as a young girl who's just seen the movie Titanic for the first time. And it has sparked some feelings in you and some questions in you. And when your mom is out of the house, you grab a couple of dolls and you decide to reenact some of the steamier scenes of the film as a way of trying to understand the mechanics of sex. And it looks a little something like this. So you're using WASD keyboard controls to spin and mash these two dolls together. And those controls are super awkward and super imprecise. And I think that imprecision is so lovely at mirroring the totally imprecise understanding of sex that this child has. And also it like super heightens that childish awkwardness of your like imaginary doll sex play. It really feels like playing with dolls without quite knowing what you're doing. There's also time pressure in this game. You have exactly 1 minute to do sex as many times as you can before mom comes home. And all of these things combine, this like pressure of time, this awkwardness of the controls, and the humor of that physics. And I just feel like it creates such an authentic narrative experience of that moment. The next one I want to talk about is called Before Your Eyes. It is a recent first-person narrative game that's controlled entirely through webcam eye tracking. In this game, you inhabit the memories of a man from his birth to his death, but the scenes only last for as long as you can keep your eyes open. If you blink, you project yourself forward in time, and it could be by minutes or by hours or sometimes by years. It's a really clever play on the whole life flashing before your eyes trope. There's a few scenes in the game where you notably cannot keep your eyes open long enough to see the resolution of the scene. And in this scene in particular, you start walking down in this painfully slow kind of dreamlike march towards the back door of your house. And you have a vague sense that something sinister is happening outside, but it's impossible to keep your eyes open long enough to see it. And then much later in the game, you return to this scene and you see that this is actually a traumatic childhood memory of your neighbor's dogs breaking into your backyard and killing the kittens of your pet cat. The thing that's so effective about this, is that the interaction of blinking in this game is often unintentional and even unwanted. Unlike most games where you spend, you're performing actions that you're trying to be enacting. You spend so much of this experience trying not to trigger the interaction. And that feeling of wanting to blink becomes really intense. First of all, it's very physically uncomfortable. You can feel your eyes starting to water. But also, the second you stop actively telling your brain not to blink, it just kind of does it anyway before you can catch yourself. And metaphorically, of course, the act of blinking is also an act of looking away. So the game is physicalizing these conscious and unconscious sensations of wanting to look away from difficult or painful memories. Next up, we've got a VR experience called Goliath. It's a virtual reality documentary about a man who's called Goliath. It's his gaming handle. He's a diagnosed schizophrenic who's found some kind of community and escape in the world of online gaming. And like many VR experiences, it's not very heavily interactive. There are large segments that are essentially operating as a film. But there are these moments where player input is invited. And one moment in particular achieves what I think might be the single most successful narrative interaction I've experienced in VR to date. So it comes at a point in the story where Goliath is recounting his history with heavy psychiatric medications. And at this point, pills kind of form and start shooting at you. And you can take your hands, which are holding the controllers, to kind of touch and pop these pills. And I'll be honest, when I was playing this for the first time, I was totally unimpressed with this. Other than being kind of a visual pun on popping pills, I did not understand why this needed to be an interactive moment or what it was adding to the experience. It kind of seemed like one of these throwaway, like give your players something to do kind of moments that I think can kind of happen in VR experiences. It can be a bit of a pitfall. And then something happens that changes everything about this moment, and it requires audio for you to understand. So I'm going to let Tilda Swinton, who did the voiceover, step in with her brilliant voice. I hope that the audio levels are going to be okay. So I apologize in advance if it's super loud.
I see you're getting more comfortable in this place. You're getting the hang of it. It does get easier, predictable even. But are you still in two places at once? From the outside, you seem like someone who's doing something very peculiar. Fighting thin air.
So for me, this is where this interaction shifts into something that's actually brilliant. It's commenting explicitly on that dual awareness that one experiences in VR. You have this headset on, and you're supposedly immersed in this alternate world, but you're still hyper aware of the physical space around you and your body in that space. And I think in particular, when you're playing a VR experience in public, or even in your house when like other people are there, that dual awareness becomes this really acute form of self-consciousness. And as you're doing these like ridiculous actions, and you know how ridiculous that you look from the outside. So in Goliath, this feels like this huge aha moment where the physical experience of being in VR itself becomes a metaphor for Goliath's personal narrative. The last example I want to share with you guys is from a game called What Remains of Edith Finch. It was BAFTA Game of the Year in 2017, among many other awards. And it's an anthology of vignettes, kind of akin to a collection of short stories. Each of them has its own narrative and its own mechanics of interaction. This example is from a chapter called Lewis's Story, which is based directly on a Lord Byron story. My husband was the producer on this project, and he clued me into that. In it, you play as Lewis, who is a man who's working a menial job at a fish cannery, and he indulges in these increasingly vivid and unhealthy daydreams of this alternate fantastical life. And you can see here on one side of the screen, Lewis's hand is grabbing and beheading fish and then tossing them away. And this is an action that you're controlling with the right joystick on a game controller. On the other side, we see his fantasy world, which is a much more complex labyrinth where you really have to pay attention to the navigation. And that's being controlled with the left joystick. It requires much more mental capacity to be paying attention over there. And as you play, you form this muscle memory for this totally rote task of pulling over these fish, beheading them, and tossing them away, while you start investing all of your active attention into this fantasy world. It's a really smart way of capturing this feeling of being lost in daydreams and really putting yourself and your spiritual energy into this total fantasy and disassociating from the world. So the question becomes, can you take one really well-designed player input and actually craft an entire narrative experience from it? And I'm sorry if that sounds like a rhetorical question, because I think the answer is an emphatic yes. Even in that last example that we watched, Lewis's Story, it takes about 15 or 20 minutes to play. And that simple interaction of just using those two joysticks, retains its freshness over the course of those 20 minutes. And there are other games that take this even further. I'm going to talk about another in a minute. It may sound counterintuitive, but this kind of repetition where you're repeating the same player input over and over again with little mechanical progression and little evolution can turn out to be a pretty amazing way to create space for a complex emotional experience for your player. The player doesn't get bogged down in learning new inputs or new mechanics. They know exactly what's expected of them and what they're supposed to do. And they're able to devote less and less mental capacity to the mechanical task. It kind of unburdens the mind and creates space for a different kind of input, which is that emotional investment and that mental reflection. And as you create an experience using a simple mechanic like this, over time, you get this accumulation, which is a way that that repetition of the input creates a deeper understanding of and opportunities for narrative. There are a few really good examples of this being applied to longer games, but the one I wanted to highlight is the recent work of our keynote speaker, Ren Breyer. And I think also I saw Tim Dawson in the audience here, who was the technical director and game designer. So this game Unpacking, it notably won the BAFTA Game of the Year for 2022, which is amazing, among many other awards. But it also won the BAFTA for Best Narrative Game. And I think that this is incredibly encouraging to see that the narrative award going to a game that does not directly depict any characters, any events, or really have any traditional elements of story whatsoever. The game is about unpacking belongings and putting them away in a series of new homes. It spans about 20 years in the life of an unnamed and unseen woman. You start in her childhood room and end in her family home. And the mechanics never change or evolve. You are opening boxes, you're pulling out objects one by one, and then you're arranging those objects throughout the living space using placement and rotation. The game creates a real feeling of intimacy with this character that you never see and you never even learn the name of. You learn about this person by what she values and how that changes over the course of several years in her life. We follow her evolving cultural and sexual identity through her things and her places. You can see here, there's specifically some objects, some Judaica objects. It's hinted early on that this may be a Jewish character because she has a little dreidel in her childhood bedroom. And then you just kind of forget about it over the course of a few moves, like it doesn't return. But then later on, when she moves into her own apartment, these cultural objects come back. And it's such a nice little detail of the way that maturing and moving away from home can cause us to run back to or re-embrace elements of our culture. One of the most poignant narrative moments in the game comes pretty early on when you're moving into your first boyfriend's apartment. Again, I might be making some gendered assumptions here by saying boyfriend. You never really see this person, but it's like this kind of stark black and white space. He's got like 4 or 5 different types of coffee machines in the kitchen, these giant weights in the living room. It feels very masculine. And you are hyper aware that you're moving into his space. Among the things that you're unpacking is your university diploma, but you'll find pretty quickly that there's no place anywhere on the wall for you to hang it. So ultimately, the only place it can go is under the bed. It's such a succinct and effective way of summarizing a relationship. There's literally no room for you in this person's life, and it's completely unsurprising when you find yourself moving into your own place the next year. It's really remarkable how fresh and how narratively deep this repeated interaction feels over the course of several hours of gameplay, even though it never changes or never evolves. Okay, so I promised I was going to bring this back to talking about XR. We are in the reality stream after all looking amazing in our VR headsets and peering in ecstasy at the face of God, as we all do when we put on VR headsets. And I wanted to end on a few final thoughts about what this means for those of us who are working in the XR space. I think the stated promise of extended reality is this, you'll hear these terms immersion and embodiment a lot. I don't know how many of you guys went to Zach Dodson's talk yesterday, but he had this great quote where he hammered that VR is not special. Immersion and embodiment are possible in many other forms of art and media. But what these technologies do offer is a new set of inputs. And those are much more gestural and intuitive, where it's kind of using the human body essentially as the main driver of the control in a way that other forms of interaction don't. And that can be through looking, through gesture, through movement, or even through using your voice. And of course, there's all sorts of new narrative possibilities in using these new inputs. So I would really encourage you, if you're working in this space, don't just try to give your audience something to do. Really try to think about how your interactions can create narrative effects. And of course, also remember that immersion and embodiment of these experiences is imperfect, and it has massive limitations. Embodiment, where you're really inhabiting your body and using your body in this way, carries a whole set of physical challenges with it. So things like awareness, you have to have one foot in the real world for safety, so you're not like tripping over tables or stepping on your cat. There's also the discomfort of the equipment itself, which can become really uncomfortable over the course of several minutes or hours. And then there's the whole thing about boundaries. There's that dreaded grid that shows up every time you kind of like take one step, like 1 inch too far to the left, and that grid pops up and reminds you like, no, get back in your lane. For me, I feel like that is more than anything a total break of immersion in VR experiences. There's also psychological challenges to this. There's that self-consciousness of performing, especially if you're in front of others. And there's also a split in awareness that happens when you're trying to keep yourself safe and your belongings safe within your boundaries. So I would just encourage you guys to work with the limitations of this medium. I think for me, the most successful experiences don't ignore these things, but actually embrace them and use them. And that's why I wanted to pull out that example from Goliath. I think that's a great example of a VR experience that uses the limitations. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of my talk. Hopefully I've given you guys a little bit to think about as you're designing, whether it's for games or VR, in a narrative way. I think I'm supposed to ask if anybody has any questions. We have just a couple minutes. Or comments.
Football?
Yeah. Thank you. I'll take it. Oh, yeah.
Is Goliath currently playable down at the exhibition?
Yes.
Is it? Oh, amazing. There you go. It is.
Shout that out, that's such a great example. I'm going to go personal experience playing. So
Yeah, great. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Oh, thank you. I'll take that too. Okay, well, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just wondering if you have any kind of like further like references or like good examples of like reading material for kind of like immersion and like experience through mechanics. I feel like nobody really talks about that very much. It's super interesting.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of this that's happening in like the academic space, but not a lot of it filters through into pop culture conversation. And I wish I could come up with some really smart examples for you off the top of my head. Definitely the C.T. Wynn book is really interesting because even though he's coming from he's not a total ludologist purist, but he's coming much more from that perspective. But even he acknowledges in that book, like there's nothing preventing you from applying these principles to narrative work. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I could think of anybody else off the top of my head. There is a lot of stuff happening in academia that kind of covers this. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you guys. Have a good rest of your day.